Hello and welcome to WITA's Exchange podcast. We are recording this week's episode on Friday, December 5th at 9 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time. So depending on when you download and listen, the trade issues we are discussing today may have changed. Of course, the trade news never stops, with news this week on trade with the UK and an agreement on pharmaceutical pricing and other developments related to China and a lot more. Today we brought back the core four to help us understand where we are in the various negotiations and other news on trade. Welcome back to the Exchange podcast to Wendy Cutler, Senior Vice President at the Asia Society Policy Institute and former Acting Deputy United States Trade Representative. Mark Linscott is a former Assistant USTR for South and Central Asia, and before that served as Assistant USTR for WTO and Multilateral Affairs. He is currently a Senior Advisor at the Asia Group and the U.S.-India Strategic Partnership Forum. Dan Mullaney, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a former assistant U.S. trade representative for Europe and the Middle East, and our discussion leader again today, Joe DeMond, chair of international trade policy and global life sciences at Crowell Global Advisors, and a former deputy assistant U.S. trade representative for Asia and the Pacific. Joe?
Thank you, Ken, and good morning, Wendy, Dan, Mark, on this snowy DC day. We'll talk about there's always chilling developments in any given week, so maybe it's appropriate that it's snowing outside. Let's start with some recent developments. I mean, maybe it's been no sort of earth-shattering announcements in the last week, I think, but there have been nonetheless some really key occurrences that have happened on the negotiating front and just more broadly globally. Let's start, Dan, in an area that you're the most familiar with, which is Europe, and I'm somewhat also familiar with because of my background in the pharmaceutical sector, which is an agreement that the US and the UK reached this week under the rubric of their bilateral prosperity agreement to lower the prices of medicines, raise the price of medicines that the UK pays coming from America, in exchange for which the UK will be exempt from tariffs that it exports to the US now and in the future, if there are future tariffs under Section 232 or if there are future investigations under Section 301. Just briefly, and I'm the one I think who probably gets the most of the weeds on stuff like this. I did read some of the statements from this. The UK is saying they're investing 25% more in medicine, and this is going to create greater access for English patients to innovative American medicines. We lead the world in the development of those. But however, the other way of looking at it is they're going to pay 25% more for the same medicines than they would have. It's kind of somewhere in between as I look at it. What's happening is that the UK agency that assesses the pricing of medicines has a threshold for cost competitiveness. And if you go above that threshold, you're considered not cost effective. And therefore, you don't get the drug. UK has agreed to raise the thresholds that it considers cost effective for patients. It's a complicated economic calculation, and that will allow more American drugs to be listed and paid for by the UK. I think that's really what's happening. I should also say that this is entirely prospective. If there's drugs that are already on the market in the UK, they're not going to get a price increase. This is about how the UK assesses new medicines that for which they're seeking approval in the foreseeable future. So, Dan, does that track with what you're hearing? And the other, I mean, Wendy, Mark, speak up as well. Does that track with what your assessment is, and what do you make of this, and how's it going over in the UK as far as you can see? Let me just say, before you speak, nothing like this has ever really been done before on drug pricing. There have been provisions that are sort of in this vein in some of our FTAs, but nothing this direct.
Yeah, no, that does track with everything that I've heard. It's interesting if you read the USTR readout and the UK readout, it's almost like two different worlds. They don't conflict, but they're definitely two different sides of the same
Accentuating
thing. Yeah.
what's self-serving to them. Yeah.
What's interesting to me is, sort of on the theme of continuity. I mean, this issue of pricing of medicines abroad has been on USTR's list for years, literally years.
Sure.
And so what's being done here, including with different higher prices for new medicines, and you're right, it's all perspective. Also, the rebates that the limits on
Right.
the
That's
rebates
true.
the companies have to repay if they sell above a certain volume. These are all things that have been on the negotiating table for quite a long time. And so this is really the first time that it's really happened. And of course, maybe in part due to the leverage presented by the tariffs and the 232 investigations and the 301 investigations. It's worth noting, I think, that the tariff exemption applies to all drugs, patented and not patented, which distinguishes it from some of the other agreements where the duty-free treatment is limited to generic drugs. And there's, of course, a huge caveat that we actually still need to see the agreement. We have the fact sheets on both sides, the statements on both sides. You probably need to see the details. The new aspect to this, which I think is interesting, is in the past, from a trade policy perspective, we've always looked at this question of, are sufficient payments being made to finance innovation in markets abroad, where countries often negotiate very low rates. What's new is the parallel process in the United States of lowering prices in the United States. So we haven't really, what the new factor is that we have two sides of the coin. On the one hand, from a trade policy perspective, we're changing the payments that are made abroad. And then in a parallel track, there's this effort from the administration to lower prices in the U.S. So I think those are two things that kind of made it come together. The other thing I'd say is that this agreement does emphasize that initial agreement, which was the first agreement the administration did with the trading partner, it's a May agreement. That really was the launching pad for subsequent agreements and subsequent negotiations. I think we're going to be seeing more of that. We've already seen two with the UK, and I think that pattern is probably going to repeat with other trading partners.
So, yeah, that's. Go ahead, Wendy. Sorry.
Yeah, Dan, can I ask you a question? Because for me, in my negotiating experience in pharmaceutical area with Asian countries, we were always reluctant and we never really got into the pricing dynamic. We ended up just really kind of pushing for transparency where we seem to be on stronger ground. So in some ways, I look at this deal like this could really backfire in other countries around the world if we're being perceived as is the country that's urging these countries to raise their prices. Like, and I understand, as you said, like the UK is trying to spin this differently. Is that a valid concern?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. You're absolutely right about that. And I think transparency was maybe a light way of trying to encourage revised pricing. But you're right. I think we've always hesitated to be the one out there pushing for higher prices for medicines. That's not going to be a popular position.
Well,
And we did it sort of a little bit through the back door, through process arguments, just as you mentioned. Yeah, but I think there's a risk, and there could be an obvious risk in the UK and other countries where this will undoubtedly be pursued. That these health agencies don't want to be spending more of their budget on pharmaceuticals. So in the countries there does risk being a very significant backlash. And the UK announcements were, as Joe accurately said, were focused more on access to cutting edge medicines in the UK and investments in the UK. And this will make the UK a great platform for manufacturing pharmaceuticals. So they're emphasizing that aspect. But clearly the prospect of higher prices is risks being unpopular.
So yeah, I just to add a little bit on this, from my background in the sector is, I do think that, as I said, that this isn't, you could talk about this in terms of raising prices. And in fact, It may, but it is also the case that you have agencies uh, called health technology assessment agencies, HTA agencies, in all these countries that are actually putting a price on the value of a person's life or life year, actually, quality adjusted life year. And if they don't think that your medicine adds enough, is too expensive to justify the price they put on a person's life, you won't get the medicine at all. So it's as much about access. It is as much about access as it is about the price. Now, governments have the right to deny access if they want to, but I think I'm just pointing out that it's a little bit nuanced there. And I would also say that this is also part of kind of the dialogue between what's going on between the U.S. pharma sector and the administration, where they have these MFN provisions where they want the lowest price in the U.S. that is, in another what's being offered in another developed country. But they've also said in exchange for that, they will try to work to get these countries to price them more to what their actual value is. The problem is when you don't have a marketplace for pricing, nobody knows what the value is. It's the one, you've got one seller because there's a patent on the product and one purchaser, the government. So there's no way for the market to know what the quote right price is. Maybe that's going too much, but let me just, one thing I do want to
Actually, Joe, if I can ask, I mean, all of you, Dan, Wendy, Joe, in terms of the broader implications of this agreement, I mean, is this potentially a one-off agreement? I mean, it kind of surprised me. It was a bit
oh,
out of the blue, but those countries that are vulnerable are those that export patented or branded pharmaceuticals to the United States. And there are also questions about, will the administration actually follow through on applying the tariffs under the 232 for pharmaceuticals? I mean, I'm sensing that kind of across the board, there's new hesitation about new tariff increases. So, will other countries who are vulnerable to this 232 be making the calculation that maybe we just need to hold out a bit and see where this goes?
they,
I mean,
Sorry,
they do, but
I think it's probably the intention of the administration to go down a list of countries for which this is an issue, and yeah, there might be increased pushback. These are really politically sensitive.
well, yeah, a few weeks ago, there was, and this isn't necessarily an issue of the reciprocal trade agreements either. A few weeks ago, there was talk of the launch of a 301 investigation into a group of countries. So the administration is clearly thinking about using their 301 authority under this. We know some of the other countries that are being considered. Australia is on the list, Japan, the perennial countries which have been of concern. You can read the special 301 report to get an idea of what those are. Europe is a big question because drug prices in Europe are set on a country basis and not by the EU itself. So it's not really a commission issue. You have to go actually talk to the German government about it. So we could see more. I think the other question is whether the United States is willing to grant tariff. Now the precedent has been set about granting duty-free treatment to exports. Are they willing to do that? Although, really the countries we export the most drugs from are generic drugs from India and China. Dan, I just want to ask one final question. We can move on from this, but we've always heard, and I heard this. I worked on the Australia issue and Korean issue that obviously the NHS is like the third rail in UK politics. It's beloved. It's sacrosanct. You can't touch it. And we were always told, and I'm sure you were told, like, don't go there. And
Correct.
I would have expected, like, on the basis of everything I've heard over the years, that there would be like riots in the street now, on the basis of this agreement, because people are just so. But I don't know that we've seen that, and I just wonder what you think. Was it overblown, or is it just that the British government has done a good job of framing the agreement to.
Yeah, I think the latter is the case. I mean, that will, I think, be the thing to watch, as this kind of percolates through the UK system and into the public and things become a little clearer. Is there strong pushback on this? And I don't know the answer. I think the administration did, launch this effort with a jurisdiction that has probably the most sensitivity of almost any country in the world about, the healthcare system and drugs. So, they dove in feet first on this one.
Yeah. So what does this mean for chlorine washed chicken? Which
Right.
is another sensitive topic in the UK.
It's as yummy as ever.
We're consuming it daily here. So let's turn to another one. I think we've probably exhausted that topic for now. Another development this last week, came at the end of last week, was that China has sent some of its diplomats, trade officials to Southeast Asia, and there were some stories coming out of there, and actually even some press releases from China, which is the key point here, where the Chinese were expressing grave concern, they said, about the economic security provisions that were reached in some of these reciprocal trade agreements. Specifically, they were in Malaysia and Cambodia, which were the two that signed up to such provisions in their reciprocal trade agreements. Just to remind everybody, what those provisions would do is in areas where the United States is applying tariffs for national security reasons or export controls, or sanctions on third countries, one of them potentially being China, of course, that the country would need to put in place measures of equivalent effect or similar effect. So the U.S. is actually asking the country to sort of outsource its trade policy toward China to the U.S. and follow the U.S. And obviously, these countries all have strong trade relationships with China. Many of them, China is their largest trading partner, puts them in a very awkward position. And she was in China earlier this year, and I think delivered some of these messages. But now the agreement has been done. They're not there, and we wondered. It took about a month for them to respond. I think some of that has to do with the fact that Trump meant she, and maybe they just wanted to stay quiet on it until that was over. But it's not surprising, I guess, is my take.
It's not surprising at all. I think what is surprising to me, even with the Xi-Trump meeting coming up, that China didn't weigh in right away before the Malaysia and Cambodia agreements were finalized, particularly given that other ASEAN countries are still, Vietnam and Indonesia in particular, are still negotiating intensively with the administration. And they needed to send a sign to those countries as well, be careful going forward. But for Malaysia and Cambodia, these deals are done. And so this gives them really two options. Do they go back and ask to renegotiate? I kind of don't think that will be a great avenue. I don't think it will go over well in Washington.
I don't think it'll go over well.
Yeah. But I also think that through implementation, maybe they're hoping that the administration won't be scrutinizing their every move. But that said, I think this does introduce a very important dynamic in these negotiations, and not just with ASEAN. I mean, look at USMCA. It was just a couple of months ago where Mexico was putting forward an increase in its tariffs, including on autos, which would have hit China. And it's kind of on hold right now. They're going to impose a 40 to 50% tariff. I can't remember which one, at which rate, and clearly under U.S. pressure to do so. So I think this dynamic is going just to be out there and is going to make it even more difficult for Vietnam and Indonesia, which presumably are in the last stages of their negotiations with the U.S.
This was already probably the most sensitive remaining issue for those two countries before
Right.
Chinese spoke. And that's the reason, and the key reason why they have not concluded their agreements. So now that China has publicly sent a shot across the bow, what does that do? I do think one thing that you put your finger on, Wendy, is that implementation is maybe where China's also heading. Like they probably recognize that you're right, the agreements can't be unwritten. But if you actually take steps to go
Right.
forward and implement this by applying tariffs on China, that we're not going to like that. I assume that was kind of the message.
Right. And this is a nightmare for these countries, particularly in Asia, where China is their largest trading partner and an important, commercial partner in various sectors. So this is going to be another challenge for them going forward. And I do wonder, like, are we really going to be able to come to a conclusion, successful conclusion in our negotiations, particularly with Vietnam and Indonesia? Because, like you, I keep hearing that they're just roadblock after roadblock. There's some serious issues out there where if no flexibility is shown by each side, we could end up in these
Yeah.
negotiations continuing into next year.
I think it's important, and I'm going to ask you a question, Mark, in a second, but just to say there's a difference here between this and other issues. The other issues, I think, were being viewed, at least by the countries that are still negotiating, Vietnam and Indonesia, as, quote, just commercial issues. These are being viewed as national security and political
Geostrategic
affairs
issues.
issues.
Yeah.
This is a bigger deal. Like the national security state in both countries is very concerned about this because of their political relationship with China, not just their trade relationship. So it's a different order of magnitude, I think.
A great point.
Mark?
Yeah, I've got two takeaways. And I think our assessment of these kinds of provisions will be evolving over time. And one of my takeaways is this is kind of experimental. This is an issue of first impression in many respects to have this kind of text in two legally binding agreements, Malaysia and Cambodia. There were efforts in the first Trump administration to collaborate with other countries with respect to concerns about China, and that was with Japan and the EU on subsidies and IPR. They came up with kind of a joint proposal, but then it went nowhere. So that was an experiment in the first Trump administration on related issues that fell flat on its face. This time, they've got entirely new approach. They're using these bilateral reciprocal trade agreements to have actual provisions that a country should mirror what the U.S. has in place. It was interesting reading some of the details because there are levels of commitment, and there can be a strong level of commitment where it's just you shall do this. And that is like I think it's Article 5.1, where it says, you shall, when we notify you, apply a tariff or a restrictive measure, essentially equivalent to what we are doing. But there are other provisions which say consistent with domestic law or shall explore. So, there's in some of these areas there's wiggle room. So, we'll see how it plays out. The second takeaway, which Wendy's really focused on and is compelling. China's got economic power here. These countries are between a rock and a hard place in terms of what to do. And I expect that they are hoping that the scrutiny on implementation will be light touch from the administration. But we'll see how it plays out. And with other negotiations, India, on the other hand, for example, I think it kind of welcomes some provisions on economic security because they've had concerns about China for a long time. They were the ones who put into place several years ago restrictions on Chinese apps, and this was after the conflict they had in Ladakh, on the line of actual control. They may actually welcome provisions in the negotiations with the United States on economic security if it's addressing some of their concerns with respect to China as well. So, we're going to have to see how this plays out, assuming that there will be new agreements. I think we'll be getting into this. We've got Malaysia and Cambodia so far. Are we going to see new legal texts in the near future with any other countries?
Yeah. I had a question. In the U.S. EU, the Trade and Technology Council under Biden administration, there was a provision that the U.S. and the EU would seek to coordinate their measures to push back on non-market economy policies and practices, which is kind of a soft approach to this effort. And so I'm wondering whether, do you think was it smart, or does it risk the backlash that we're talking about to have put it in agreements as obligations, as opposed to, we will work together and seek to coordinate measures, something more soft? I understand the desire to ramp up the so-called cooperation. Did this go too far because it triggered?
I think, just to start on this, I think first of all, yeah, it's really interesting phenomena you're pointing out there. than, which is the treatment of our some of our allies and the more developed economies is a bit different than on these emerging and developing economies. I think one surmise I have is I think the U.S. may feel that the EU is already gets the point about the economic security point with respect to China and some of the efforts that it's taken. It's actually trying to force these countries, which is the most excruciating, to take a side. And they feel the EU has already taken its side. To some extent, maybe India has already taken its side, but these countries have never taken a side because they can't. It's very difficult for them to, and they're trying to push it. So, from the U.S. perspective, that's, I guess, in the short run, and everything is short run. I think it's a good thing, but in the longer run, it puts them in a very difficult position.
Well, we see that the emperor has no clothes here. That we've got these provisions in two agreements, which are on paper pretty impressive. If that's the goal. But as Wendy was highlighting, how are they implemented, and are they actually implemented? What if they aren't implemented? How does the administration react? Is it going to leave these agreements, terminate these agreements, which means it can raise its own tariff? But I think the administration is hesitant to do that now. And it loses a lot by terminating these agreements because it got zero tariffs from some of these countries. I mean, unprecedented market access. So, it's really going to be interesting to see.
I think IEEPA, this is one area where IEEPA may matter, that presumably if U.S. wanted to enforce this in the future, they could say, we're going to raise your reciprocal tariff from 20 to 40% or whatever. But there's got to be some hook. National security, hook on this. I mean, you can't. I don't think you can use 301. It's not unfair trade. I mean, it'd be difficult to use some of these other provisions. More difficult, I think. 232 is sectoral. So I think it's different. But they would have to go to, I think, a pretty drastic option like that. And would they to say, we're gonna up your reciprocal tariff because you're not mirroring our trade policy towards China or Russia.
The other area, like related here too, and it's in kind of this economic security bucket, I guess, would be the increasing interest of the U.S. in these agreements to include language whereby we can scrutinize their agreements with China, with other countries as well. And here I thought it was interesting that there's language that kind of across the board with any agreement, right? But it's any new agreement, which for me, just putting it out there, a new agreement, RCEP or CPTPP aren't new agreements. So let's just say if China were to join CPTPP, is that a new agreement? Maybe, maybe not. The ASEANs already have their own agreements with China, so presumably they keep building on them. But the other area that's highlighted in these agreements is U.S. scrutiny over digital agreements as well. Yeah. And so that's new, and we'll have to see how that plays out as well. And I think within the USMCA renegotiation context, all of these issues are going to be on steroids.
Well, and of course, that I think the USMCA during Trump 1 kind of fired the shot across the bow with respect to agreements. So,
and it was kind of weak, but you could see, I think that's an area that they're going to look to strengthen.
Yeah, and there's so many areas. It started in Trump 1, and now in Trump 2, it's on steroids.
I think, well, one area where I think it's going to become more prominent in the digital area, of course, is AI, and an issue that really didn't exist much earlier than the last couple of years, because of this because of this global competition for superiority between the U.S. and China, where the U.S., with a lot of the support from the U.S. tech sector, was going around and working to get countries to adopt U.S. standards, the U.S. AI stack, and pushing back on China. This is viewed as really the next big area, or already is big, commercial area, and fight for the future. So that was not around when USMCA was done 5 years ago. That's going to, I think, come back. It could come back in a big way there. But I think we may only be beginning to see this issue emerge with respect to third countries. And I just want to go back to the point, Dan, you raised with respect to the UK. It's like, are these agreements ever done? I mean, I think we made this point before. It's like, oh, by the way, it's like I think Chris said it was Colombo, maybe one of you said it was Colombo coming back. Like, for those of our younger viewers are going to have to check that reference. So
well, I say it's holiday time, and we keep on saying, the giving season. Well, these agreements keep on giving.
The gift that gives that keeps on giving. So you think it's done, but we may come back and the agreement's very clear that the U.S. can come back and.
But the other model that we followed in the past, which has some serious downsides, is nothing's done till everything's done. So we saw this with TTIP and a bunch of other agreements where you're negotiating, you're not done, you're not showing progress. Nobody has a sense that there's real forward movement. And if you don't manage to push this whole package over the line at once, then the whole thing sinks, which is what happened with TTIP and maybe some others. This is a different approach, and I don't know that it's less viable of saying, okay, now we got an agreement here, we got a firm agreement on tariffs, clear obligation. Okay, now we're going to do one on conformity assessment, or now we're going to do one on automobile standards, and sort of having progressive progress in these agreements is kind of another model. It's not one that we're used to, where it's like one comprehensive package, nothing's done till everything's done. But on the other hand, here we are, 9 months into the administration with 17 agreements in place with a lot of countries around the world, and some specific obligations and others to come. So it's a different model. I'm not sure it's a worse model, to be honest.
Yeah, but on that point, Dan, I mean, you said 17 agreements. In fact, we don't really have 17 agreements, and we have kind of stable reciprocal tariffs for some of these countries, but they're still negotiating the agreement. I mean, perhaps there's been a joint statement or a fact sheet, but only with Malaysia and Cambodia do we have the full text of a legally binding agreement. I've heard people, on the inside kind of tell me that really matters. And so they're trying to negotiate with all these other countries for similar agreements, but they're not done yet. So
no, they're not. I mean, that's a good point. We haven't seen the text. Wendy, let me ask you about that. I mean, Japan and Korea have sort of been considered done, except for the investment, which is that's a big exception, except for the investment fund provisions. But are they also, as far as are they also still reviewing, the other, the fine print on the other trade provisions of these agreements, or at least those parts done?
Yeah, because some of the provisions, like in the UK and other agreements, they contemplate, how you're going to be treated under a Section 232 agreement. But let's just take example. Japan now has, let's just say, the 232 MFN pharmaceutical clause. Like, what does that mean now with the UK deal done? So again, I think they have to work through a lot of these details. I also hear that some of these countries, without naming names, they don't even want a legal text, right? Because a lot of new issues will come up. And for them, many of them, they're going to have to then seek legislative approval, which is going to bring all of these issues to the forefront. So while the US may be pushing for these detailed legal text, I'm not sure we're going to end up there, particularly with some of our larger.
No, which raises, I think, the question: how can you enforce an agreement if you don't have the text of it? I mean,
yeah, and they have the reciprocal tariffs. I mean, all these countries have a reciprocal tariff now. Now, the threat is that if they don't negotiate seriously, then they're going to get a higher tariff in response. But for the moment, it seems like things are stable. So I can imagine and understand why they would start to slow down in negotiating more detailed provisions in what is considered legally binding text.
Especially with the IEPA decision still pending.
Yeah,
I mean,
totally.
Why not at least wait for that shoe to drop and see what happens? I mean, we all think the administration is going to go to some alternative. I think we all think the administration has some sort of alternative plan for tariffs, but why not wait and see what that is and how that works before making your commitments? I think that makes sense. I've also heard, though, that some of these agreements that are outstanding, I think there's sort of a tacit acknowledgement that the administration that they may not get done this year. I think they were pushing for them all to get done by the end of this year, and now that seems. But you would have to, in order to do that, they would need to make some concessions, basically, or rush through some things that they don't want to rush through. And I found that interesting because I would have thought tactically the administration would, like this, in terms of trade-offs here, it might be better to get anything done before IEPA, at least you've got something. But they seem to not be, what I'm kind of hearing is that the pace of the negotiations is, I don't know if slowed is a bit, but they're going deep into some of these issues. Like we talked about economic security. They cannot, and the administration is not willing to just blow them off or apply some very vague language to them. So this could go, I think it's interesting that they're viewing the getting the specificity as in some ways more important than concluding a deal quickly.
That might be USTR's point of view. We'll see.
That's always USTR.
Right.
So
exactly. We know where we're from and how we were trained.
Well, that was always the mantra we always had to say, which is no deadline. You never wanted to seem eager. Never want to seem eager. To get a deal done. That's a sign of weakness. And
we're 21 episodes in now, and I think in our
who's counting?
In our first couple of episodes, I think it's 21. In our first couple of episodes, I think we were all predicting this, that, these negotiations on these hard issues, and you're getting into TBT and SPS and, labor and environment, it's going to take time. And, it's an unprecedented agenda. And there's just no way you're going to get a lot more agreements done before the end of this year. So I think our predictions are basically playing out as being accurate from that time.
Also, I think in terms of you had this imposition of threat of huge tariffs, and then imposition of huge tariffs, and then kind of a slow kind of winnowing away of some of these tariffs, exemptions for manufacturers, products that we don't make. I mean, I think we kind of anticipated that as the costs of the tariffs became apparent, and some of these deals came into place, that there's probably be even a slowdown and maybe even a ratcheting back of some of the tariffs, which I think is probably good news for the trading partners and maybe for the trading system. I think we're seeing that now. You haven't really had announcements of new tariffs or tariff threats. It's mostly been going the other direction.
And they're showing great care, it seems, on the 232 cases with respect to pharmaceuticals and semiconductors for similar reasons. Well, first of all, I think they understand now there'd be huge supply chain disruption. So it's not even just a question of the tariff; it's a question of, are people going to be able to get chips and medicine, from these countries? But I think that's one of the reasons, though, that I agree with you, that the price is also, affordability issue is also weighing on them. On that.
The other dynamic, just to introduce as well, and I think the administration has been pretty out there on this, that particularly with respect to China, that given the president's upcoming trip in April, they don't want to do anything that would be viewed by China as provocative across the relationship. But here I'm just going to focus on the tariff side, and to the extent that any of these Section 232 tariff announcements would result in higher and substantial tariffs for China, that could be something that they want to avoid now as well. I mean, I think we predicted from day one, these 232 investigations, even when people are saying from the administration, we're going to be done with semiconductors, in a month or, in a few months, that the more you delve into these issues and you think how you're going to apply these tariffs, particularly those that are components, it gets so complicated so quickly. And also with the affordability agenda, all of these derivative products now as well, I have to conclude are being questioned by some in the administration, particularly when you look at semiconductors, because the coverage of the semiconductor 232 was to include all these electronic products as well.
Right. Consumer
which
goods.
must be, I assume, is being reassessed. I hope it is.
I would think, and I think that certainly you want to, maybe when it comes to consumer electronics, you might want to avoid the Christmas season, right? So maybe it's after that. Sorry, Mark. What were you gonna
I think
say?
No, nothing to add.
Let's turn to something we've been hearing from some trade wonks, which is the fact that we've negotiated all of these free trade agreements in the past before this administration. In fact, this administration itself, Trump 1 negotiated one of the key ones, or renegotiated one of the key ones, which is USMCA. And I think people are wondering what the status of these agreements are. They were passed by Congress. You know, these are actually the law of the land from a formal legal perspective. And you do, and it's not really clear. The administration doesn't talk about them so much, although it's going to have to. It is starting to talk about USMCA for, you know, because of the review coming up. We can talk more about that. But what is your take on, are these agreements dead letters? Are they, the administration still sometimes uses them or refers to them if it needs to? Just I think there's a certain amount of confusion out there.
I mean, I found it remarkable starting with the UK deal and then the EU deal and then even more with Malaysia, you know, how closely there is the overlay between those agreements and, you know, some of the FTAs that we have out there. So I think from my perspective, you know, it seems like the general principles that we've been pursuing on technical barriers to trade, TBT or SPS or these other issues, those are still priorities. And the FTAs have the mechanisms for pursuing those priorities. So you could have a general statement in these recent agreements about, you know, use of international standards or you know, notice and comment or good regulatory practices. But if you actually want to enforce it or have a discussion, it seems logical to me, those FTAs are still there, that you would pull out the FTAs, you would use the committee structures in those FTAs to talk about the TBT SPS issues, and, you know, look to the FTAs for the specific obligations where it doesn't seem like the current agreements, you know, contradict any of those. It's more of a short form of a lot of the really long chapters that were negotiated in FTAs. So I've got a sense that they're still, you know, still very useful going forward.
Still a value, yeah.
Yeah, with one big exception though, and that's tariffs.
Yeah, but the FTA partners are accepting the tariff realignment, right? So
Sure. But you still had schedules agreed in those FTAs, and they've been thrown out the window. And I think
By
you
us.
know, in terms of what happens in the future, and we could have a next administration that wants the FTAs fully back in force and in place, but that would mean lowering tariffs, which has political costs. You know, once tariffs are applied, you've got, you know, certain sectors that like having those tariffs in place. So, you know, it just kind of complicates things for a future administration if they wanted to put those FTAs fully back in place, including with tariff schedules.
you know, if you remember Trump 1.0, like within the first, you know, year, he was threatening particularly to withdraw from Chorus, and it was a very real threat. This time around, you don't hear them talking about that. I mean, clearly Korea has bought into the higher tariffs. What will be interesting to see, and that's something that Dan mentioned, as Korea and the US pursue non-tariff measure elimination, do they do this within the, you know, the bureaucratic structure of Chorus FTA, or do they do this separately? And that will give us a clue as to how these FTAs might be used. But one point I just want to get back to what Dan said. I think these agreements, if you look at them in like the SPS and some of these other areas, it's like a short form of these obligations, as Dan mentioned. And I think like we can get away with that now because there's no dispute settlement mechanism. So
Right.
we're judging whether a country is, you know, you have one sentence on SPS, do this in line with science, you know, with science-based, you know, with science, any agriculture
Right.
restrictions. And then we're the ones judging it.
Exactly.
when it was a panel, you needed pages and pages of details so a panel would know how, where to come out on this. So in some ways, when I read these agreements and I say, yeah, they cover all of these areas, it's so cursory, but it's so obvious to me that the details are less important now in those areas because of the ability of the US to enforce these agreements unilaterally. But I think Dan makes a great point that if we do have problems with FTA partners, then it probably is in our interest to keep those provisions of the FTAs intact and alive.
Yeah, and that is your ground for a 301 investigation, because violation of an agreement like an FTA
Exactly.
is 301.
Right.
So the FTA provides the U.S. domestic enforcement tool.
Well, and I think the point is, it's a kind of a win-win from this perspective, that we've been able to exempt ourselves from our obligations and get away with it, and still hold the other trading partner to its obligations, which are legal obligations, and many of them, and which were enacted by those countries' parliaments. So, what's not to like about it? We're just about out of time. We want to talk about let's make a note for next week. I think it'll be a similar crew. To talk about USMCA, because that has started to come to the fore more recently, obviously, because there is a review starting of the agreement. I think we want to talk about what the review was meant to be, what it is, how the administration is looking at it, and how the private sector is reacting to it, as well as obviously Mexico and Canada. So maybe we'll just leave that little cliffhanger out there for which will excite our fans, I'm sure, excite our viewers. They can barely wait for a discussion like that next week. Thanks, everybody. So if you don't mind, I think we need to stop here. I'd like to thank everybody for listening. This is Joe DeMond. Please, thank you for joining us this week, and please join us next week for WITA's Friday Exchange.
Thank you for watching and listening to WITA's Friday Exchange. WITA is the International Trade Membership Association. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. New episodes drop every Friday, and you'll be the first to know. Thank you for joining us, and we'll be back next week with WITA's Friday Exchange.